You guys ever get a call from somebody that you don't want to speak to? You know, like as soon as their name comes up on your caller ID, just something happens inside of you and you're like, not today. Right, so what do? Your thumb reaches over to that red button that says decline, send to voicemail, adios, I will talk to you, or maybe not, later. We do this to people that we know and love. Because you're like, hey, normally I would want to answer the call, but today, today, like I know why you're calling. I know what you have to say. I know what you're kind of driving here, and I don't really want to have that conversation right now. And so you go ahead and you send them to voicemail. You have done this to people while you were already on the phone with them. Where you're engaging in the conversation, you're like, I'm over this, right? The volume increases and increases till your willingness to engage decreases and your thumb reaches for the button. You hang up the phone. You've done this to your mother-in-law. Not my mother-in-law. Bonnie Weaver is a saint, but y'all's mother-in-laws I've heard about. I've heard some rumors. Right, and you hang up the phone. And this idea of declining, sending to voicemail, hanging up the phone after even engaging in the conversation, that's not just a phone conversation, right? We do this to God all the time. Where God speaks to us directly, His Holy Spirit indwells us, and He kind of commissions us forward. And then as disciples, He gives us directives. He's not a silent God. He speaks to us. And in those moments, too often, we're like, God, I would, but I'm busy. Like, God, I would, but actually what I'm doing right now is a lot of fun, and if you could just call me later, I might have time for you, but right now I'm going to keep doing me. Too often we get these calls from God, and we just kind of push it over to voicemail. And the question that I want to ask you today, and the question that we need to wrestle with is, when that is our heart posture, when we're like, hey, God, I'm going to go my own way because I either know better or I want different than what you are offering me, what happens not just out here, but what happens in us as we decline the call that we were meant to receive? If you've got your Bibles, I want to invite you to open up to Jonah chapter 1. And as you get there, I'm Josh. I'm the lead pastor here at 180 Life Church, and we are entering into a 5-week series where we're engaging in what I would say is one of the most interesting books in the Bible. It's full of action and drama and ironic language. If it had a genre, it would be satire. It's this communication from God that is so different than other books of the Bible. And it's got God's humor in it. If you were wondering if God has a sense of humor because a duck-billed platypus was not evidence enough, this book, even in the first verse, we're going to get to see how God uses humor to point us back to Himself. The book of Jonah is wild. Now, I want to address something. See, most of us, when we're reading the Bible, we read it wrong. We've got this tendency, or at least I'll speak for myself. I have a tendency where I read the Bible and I see the main character and I see the hero and I say, I want to be him. And so I'm David, and I go, where's my giant that I need to fight? Or I'm Daniel, and I've been cast into the lion's den. Or I'm Peter walking on water. We want to be the hero and the main character. And here's the deal. Normally, I would say that's not true. Normally, we don't like to admit it, but normally, we're not the hero. We're the problem. Normally, we're not the main character. He is. We don't get credit for that. And yet, in the book of Jonah, it's a little bit different. See, the book of Jonah, you and I, we are meant to identify with the main character. The book of Jonah is meant to be a mirror for us, and we get to be the main character. Although we don't get to be the hero, we're actually still the problem. See, Jonah is meant to be a mirror where we look in and we see our reflection and we see the different things that God has called us to or invited us into that we push back against, and we get to see through a man named Jonah what that looks like in our lives. But before we get into this book, I want to address the giant fish in the room. See, most of us, we've heard about Jonah. If I were to ask you, you might be like, oh, it's about a guy who kind of went his own way. He was swallowed by a fish. You might even say a whale. It wasn't a whale. It was a big fish. And that's kind of all we know about it. But here's the deal. This book is so much more. The main point of Jonah is not the fish. The fish isn't the point. In fact, what if I told you, most of us would be surprised to hear that the big fish is actually only in 3 verses of the entire book. That's it. The fish is not the point. The reason this happens, Tim Mackey calls this the VeggieTale effect. It's kind of just the idea from children's stories and from children's books or even children's Bibles. We kind of allow that to dictate our belief in Scripture a little bit. Sometimes some of us might not have even read Jonah in the Old Testament. We might have just got it from VeggieTales. And the reality is that kids' movies are going to miss it, and this book wasn't written for kids. Like as we dive into this, you're going to see there's going to be a lot of pieces that are missed. The fish is not the point. We need to dive in together. Here's my ask, is if you have an understanding, or maybe don't, of Jonah, I'm not asking you to forget everything you know. I just want you to kind of just pick it up. I'm just going to put it over here right now. Because as we dive into this book, I think we're going to learn a ton of stuff. I dove into multiple studies in reading this or in preparing for this sermon series, and I was honestly, I was a little bit upset by how little I knew about Jonah. And the hope is that as we engage together, we can grow in experiencing God's love and his mercy and his grace as we learn a little bit about Jonah. And as we look in the mirror, maybe learn a little bit about ourselves as well. It starts in verse 1. It says, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai." In other words, ring, ring, who's on the other line? The creator of the universe, right? Like the call has been placed, and the word of the Lord came to Jonah, and it starts with a really interesting word, and we wouldn't know it in our context, but in Jewish culture back in the day, that word now actually meant something. It's how they would start a story. It was our equivalent to once upon a time. Now, that's not to say that this isn't true. This isn't a fairy tale. It's in Scripture and it's accurate. But what it does is it's given us a little bit of context of why, or at least the direction of this story. It's given us a little bit of an idea of why it was created and what it is all about. This is a story. See, most books of the prophets started radically different. See, a book of the prophet would normally start with a lot of context. It would say, hey, during this time and during the reign of this king, and this is who this prophet is, and this is what was going on in that day. And we get almost none of that in the book of Jonah. Like, it doesn't give us the historical context. In fact, I'm going to give you two examples. These are two prophets that existed during Jonah's time. We've got Hosea and we've got Amos, and this is how these books started. Hosea, it says, "The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, son of Beeri, during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and during the reign of Jeroboam, son of Jehoash, king of Israel," right? It's a history. It's giving us some context of what's going on. Amos starts like this. It says, "The words of Amos, one of the shepherds of Tekoa, the vision he saw concerning Israel 2 years before the earthquake, when Uzziah was king of Judah, and Jeroboam was son of Jehoash, was the king of Israel." So what we're getting here is we're getting a ton of context, and what we're getting with Jonah is a ton of not. Right? There's not any historical context, and the reason is because the why is different. See, Jonah isn't meant to be a history. It's meant to be a mirror for us to look into and see, oh, you know what? I'm like him. I do the same things that Jonah does, and I miss it far too often. See, Jonah's not focused on the historical details. Now, does that make it not true? Well, that isn't true. See, we know that from our own experience. See, you would ask me my testimony. You say, "Josh, what's your testimony?" And I'm not going to say, well, on December 3rd, 1988, it was a Saturday. It was nighttime during the end of Reagan's term as president. 2 sons were born, Josh and Nathan. Don't ask me who was born first. Like, that's not how I'm going to tell my testimony. Well, right, because the historical details don't matter. It's about the heart. It's about the life changes. It's about what God did. And in the same way, the story of Jonah sets itself completely apart from other stories in the Bible because it's saying, hey, this isn't about the history. This is about something else. Let's look in the mirror together. It says now, and after it says now, we know a little bit more about Jonah than this book presents. Jonah is mentioned 2 other times in the Bible, and each time he's mentioned, it's not really in a super positive light, and we know that Jonah is a prophet for 2 reasons. Why? Well, one, now the word of the Lord came to Jonah. That's how God would interact with his prophets, but also, we know this from 2 Kings, which is not a very funny book. And it's a book that mentions Jonah as a prophet. Like there's this man who has cell reception with the Lord, audible conversations with God, and something goes down. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, and that is where we'd laugh. That's the humorous part. Like, go ahead, laugh with me. No, I'm just kidding. You don't understand it yet. I'll explain it. See, Jonah, son of Amittai, 2 things would happen when you're hearing this first verse. 2 things. First is you got to know that in Jewish culture, this story was told over and over and over again. So if you are hearing this story in Jewish culture, you know the story well. The second thing is you know what his name means. See, Jonah means dove, which represents innocence and purity, and Amittai means faithfulness. And so what we're seeing here is we're seeing innocent son of faithfulness. And if you know this story, you know that everybody in the book of Jonah finds a way to be faithful to the Lord. The pagan sailors to the terrorist nation of Nineveh all find a way to turn to the Lord except for a prophet named Jonah. It's an ironic name. And in American culture, that's actually something that we find very funny. I'm going to give you an example. In a moment, we're going to have a picture come up on the screen, and I want you to shout out an ironic name for this person. Now, hear me. We're in church. Some of you be living a little too free. Let's keep it appropriate. But we're going to have a picture. Go ahead and first picture. What is it? Give me an ironic name. Gimpy. I love it. Yeah, Little John, right? Tiny. Well, give me the next one. This is Usain Bolt. One of the least ironic names of all time. What was it? Turtle. That's a good one. What else? Speed is probably not. It's like on the nose. Maybe Slowpoke, right? All right, last one. Mr. Cool. Who said handsome? That's so messed up. Hopefully Jenny's not in service to hear that one. I knew what I opened myself up to. It's fine. But we get it, right? Like, ironic names are funny. We hear this. We go, innocent son of faithfulness. Oh my gosh, that's funny because he's not. It's ironic language, and it's meant to usher us into a story where we get to look in the mirror and go, you know what? It's not just that he's not. We're not either. We hear innocent son of faithfulness, and we would laugh. See, he's got God's phone number on speed dial, and what we're going to find out in a little bit is that he gets the call, and like us, he goes his own way. The story continues. God speaks to him directly. This is what God says. Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, for their wickedness has come up before me. Now, that word for great is going to come up a lot. See, Nineveh is that great city, and the word great is gadol in the Hebrew. In fact, everybody say gadol. Gadol, and what that means is it doesn't just mean great, it means massive, it means huge, it means mighty, it means incredibly large. And you're going to find out that everything in the book of Jonah seems to be gadol. Over and over again, the fish, it's huge, it's gadol. The city is gadol, the waves are gadol, the storm is gadol. In fact, this book may have taken place in Texas because everything is bigger in the book of Jonah. Everything seems to be over and over again. It is gadol. It is massive. Why? Because this is a larger-than-life story that gives us the extremes that we can look in on our own hearts and see that we live in the extremes too, even when we don't see it. God says, arise, Jonah, and he gives 3 commands in this. He says, arise, go out, and cry out. And that's pretty typical. If you look through the books of the prophets, you're going to see that God actually used this language all the time. He would tell them, arise. He'd call them up. He'd say, hey, I want you to go somewhere, and I want you to cry out the message that I have for you. This would seem pretty standard if it weren't for just one word that's stuck in there, and it's Nineveh. See, God says, hey, I want you to go to Nineveh. Up to this point, see, Nineveh was a part of a city that was a part of Assyria, and Assyria was a foreign nation. Up to this point, God had called his prophets to nations, but it was the nation of Israel that he would call them to. Say, go to Israel, and you might talk about foreign nations, but it wasn't in a good light, and it wasn't to redeem them. You're going to bring Israel back into alignment with their creator. And yet this time, God says, no. I don't want you to go to Israel. I actually want you to go into Assyria, and I want you to go into Nineveh. Now, Nineveh, if you know anything about it, and you might not, was not a really great place. It wasn't known for being this place that you would want to visit. It was actually kind of the opposite. The book of Nahum actually highlights Nineveh, and the whole book of Nahum in the Bible is about how Nineveh isn't doing great, and they're about to fall. It highlights the fall of Nineveh to the Babylonians, and this is how much Nineveh was loved. It said that they cried out to the nations around them for help, and the nations around them rejoiced that the one who had oppressed them was now gone. See, Nineveh was not a loved nation. It was a terrorist nation. Actually, artifacts and manuscripts outside of the Bible have been found that have highlighted some of the things that they would do. They would skin people alive. They would cut off the fighting men who went against them. The fighting men, they cut off their hands. They put their eyes out. Anybody who was left alive would be invited into some of the most cruel slavery that had ever been known to man. Like, this was not a nation that was full of Care Bears and unicorns. Like, this was a place that was tough, that was hard, and was wrapped up in evil. And God said, hey, I want you to go there. And I bring this context up because it's really important. A lot of times we'll hear this message from the Lord, And, oh, Jonah needs to go to Nineveh, and we'll be like, okay, so he's just calling him to someone that maybe he doesn't like a whole lot. So maybe it's like me. Like I struggle because I don't like my boss a whole lot. He kind of grinds my gears a little bit. And so maybe it's like God calling me to my boss and me not sharing the gospel with him. Or maybe it's that neighbor whose dog barks way too much, and you're like, they don't deserve Jesus. Like, they need to fix their dog, right? Like, we've got these ideas, and I would say it's way more extreme than that. See, here's the thing. We would say, you know what, if God audibly came to me and said, hey, talk to your boss, I'd do it. But that makes sense. If God told me to talk to my neighbor, I'd do it. Sure, I'll do that. Jonah's not getting it. I'm not like Jonah, but that's not the case. See, here's the deal. This is way more extreme than your boss and your neighbor. This is the equivalent. When I was serving in the Army, I was training in Fort Lee, Virginia, and it was during that time that we found out that Osama bin Laden had been killed. And I know that name, especially in this area, has a special weight to it. And during that time, the entire base celebrated. And this is the equivalent. This story right here is if God, before bin Laden died or before Nazi Germany fell, God going to you and saying, hey, those people, that's who I want you to share the gospel with. That's the weight I want you to feel right now, because Jonah hears this, and this is a nation that has terrorized him not only his whole life, but terrorized Israel for centuries up to this point. And there is a weight when God says, hey, I want you to go to Nineveh to share who I am. And Jonah runs away. Most of us would probably run too. We, as we look in the mirror, we need to see that we are a lot like Jonah. See, that the challenge is that if you have a line in the sand with God, he's probably going to call you across it. It's part of being stretched and grown. He's going to call you to the places that you say, God, like, I'll follow you anywhere except that person. Like, God, I'll do whatever you want, minus that one thing. God, don't invite me to that. Listen, I had a line in the sand. I believed when I was growing up in Florida that everything north of Georgia was Canada. I said, God, you're not going to do that. You love me too much. And here I am. Right? Like, God, like if you put a line in the sand, like he's going to call you across it. Why? To grow you, to develop you, but also because there's people that need to be reached and lost that need to hear his truth. The story continues. It says, but Jonah arose. It's not ever good. Like, but God is always good. Like, it's like, hey, in their unfaithfulness, but God demonstrates his love for us in this. Like, but God, incredible. But anybody else, not good. It says, but Jonah arose, good start, to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. In other words, Jonah says, adios, call over, call ended, hang up the phone, send a voicemail, whatever it is. I am out of here. I'm done with this call that you have for me, Lord. I'm not going to Nineveh. And it would be easy to hear this. I even think about the first time that I read this story. I read Tarshish, and I was like, oh, it's probably just a city, nation in the other direction. And that's true, but again, this book is Gadol, right? Like this book lives in the extremes, and we need to know how extreme it is. So we've got a map that's going to come up, and so here's what we have. We've got Gath Hefer, that's where Jonah was, and it says he goes down into Joppa, we'll get there in a minute, and he flees to Tarshish. Now what you need to know about this is one, yes, it's in the other direction of Nineveh, but there's more than that. See, this is the known world. This is what Jonah knows about the world right now during his time. And he's saying, I'm going to go as far as I possibly can. Like, I'm going to go to the edge of the earth. Like, I'm going to get as far over as I can because I am fleeing from the presence of the Lord, and especially fleeing from that place called Nineveh. The other reason that this is extreme is because what we learn in Isaiah 66. See, in Isaiah 66, verse 19, it lists off a bunch of nations. And these are different countries. These are foreign nations. And at the end of it, it says, and they did not know the fame of the Lord. And so what he's doing right now is he's fleeing to a place that doesn't know God. He's fleeing from the presence of God as far as he knows to go to a place that has never experienced the grace and glory of God yet. In other words, hangs up the phone and he tries to get somewhere without cell reception. It's like this. You've seen this in an FBI movie before where like there's an FBI pursuit and it's like they're hot on their trail and there's two people in the driver's seat and one of them's driving, the other one's on their phone texting. The driver looks over and says, what are you doing? Grabs the phone. What's he do? Rolls down the window, throws it out. He's like, no, we're getting somewhere where we're off the grid. We're not going to get caught. And that's exactly what Jonah is trying to do. He's going as far as he possibly can. And in the mirror, as we look in, we do the same thing. Like when God gives us the call, we try to just kind of, no, God, that's cool and all, but I'm going to go over here. Like, God, yeah, I know you're asking me to do that in this relationship. I know you're asking me to seek forgiveness. I know that you're asking me to share your truth. I know you're asking me to steward responsibly. I know you're asking me to do these things, but I'm just going to kind of go the way that I want. And we also flee from the presence of the Lord to Tarshish as well. It's extreme, and our lives are extreme too. See, growing up, I had this, some of you in high school maybe can relate. I had this homework strategy. It would go like this. I would get homework, and that'd really be it. Wouldn't do it, wouldn't turn it back. That would just kind of be it. Like, because it would get in the way of me having fun and hanging out with my friends. And so I just kind of leave it on the side. I wouldn't address it until eventually the mound piled up, and my teacher found out, and then my grades found out, and then my parents found out, and then I found out that I couldn't have fun and hang out with my friends anymore, because there were consequences for me ignoring the call that I was meant to have. Now listen, Jonah's doing the same thing. Where he's saying, no, consequences, I'm going to push those aside. I'm not worried about that. I'm going to flee from the presence of the Lord and hopefully get far enough that he can't reach me anymore. Jonah says, I'm going to get out of here, and we do the same thing. Y'all, we are a disciple-making church. Like, my hope is that even if you were here for the first time, you've heard multiple times at this point that we exist to make and send disciples who love and live like Jesus. Like, that is the mission of our church. That's what we're getting after. And why is that? It's because that's what Jesus called us to. And yet, too often we get these calls and we kind of get wishy-washy about it. And we go, but I'm a little busy right now, and I'm going to go my own way. I'm going to travel my own path. I was in a conversation with pastors this week, and one of them asked, he said, hey, why would people not want to do this? And I think the answer is pretty simple. Most people, we're so caught up in our normal rhythms that we're not willing to change what we're doing. I've even heard before, I was like, hey, I've been in ministry longer than you've been alive. And that's great and all, but that's not a reason to go unchanged. Like, a disciple is somebody who's following Jesus, being changed by Jesus, committed to the mission of Jesus. We're meant to move forward on his path, his mission, and the challenge is doing it the wrong way for a long period of time doesn't make it right. If duration is your explanation for not changing, you are missing half of the gospel. Like, if you have been doing it a long time so you don't want to change, you're missing half the gospel. Like, God works from the outside edges in. I've said it before, like a year ago, I thought I was moving forward in obedience, and yet God was shaping me and convicting me on things that I dealt with back then, but now, a year later, he's got new things for me that I didn't even know were a problem back then. And in his grace and mercy, he works in layers in us, and over again, we're called to something better. We're meant to be changed. Saying that I'm not going to change or I'm going to just kind of stick with the status quo is the equivalent of saying I've been drowning my whole life, the water is all I know, and I've treaded this long. Yo, get out the water. Like, you're not meant to tread. You don't have the ability to sustain yourself. You can't do it on your own. Like, God has you and he has something better for you, but he's going to make you, or at least require you, to invite him to do his part. Like, he did the heavy lifting, we have to accept the gift. And over again, we forget that we're meant to trust him and lean on him and be changed by him. See, the book of Jonah is meant to be a lot like spinach. You know, like we've got this tendency where we think that something doesn't look good, taste good, feel good, and so we don't do it, right? And that's, for some of us, that's exactly what discipleship is. We're like, well, it doesn't look good, it doesn't feel good, it doesn't seem like it would taste good, and so I don't want to do it. Well, a couple lies in that. First is Adam and Eve. If you know anything about the fall, Eve saw something that looked good, something that tasted good. It said it was pleasing to the eye and looked good to eat. And what did she do? She bit it. Adam did the same thing, and what happened? The fall of mankind. Just because it looks good, tastes good, feel good, doesn't mean it is good. And at the same time, think about spinach. Spinach doesn't look good. I don't care who you are. It does not look good. Spinach doesn't feel good. It's like the vegetable version of oatmeal. Like, it's not good. Some of us think it doesn't taste good. I know some of you think it's good, but stick with the metaphor. And yet, just because it doesn't look good, feel good, taste good, I mean, doctors and Popeye agree. It is good. The point is that just because you don't like the direction that you're being called doesn't mean it's not the best thing for you. Just because it's challenging to stomach it for a moment doesn't mean it's not the best thing for you. And God's going to call you to the best thing for you, not in this life, but through eternity, that he's calling you to something bigger and better than you could ever step into on your own. And too often we get the call and we say, yeah, God, I just don't want spinach right now. I'm going to give you guys some spiritual veggies real quick, and I'm going to hit them a little bit hard. We are a disciple-making church. I've already said it, and we're here to make disciples, and Jesus has given us this call, and some of us are sitting in these chairs, and we're like, yeah, but I'm not going to do that. And if you are here, where that's our mission, and if you are following Jesus who commissioned us with that mission, and you're not willing to do it, my question for you is, and I'm asking this in gentleness and love, why are you here? And that's not me pushing you out. I want you to reflect on it. Because I want to challenge you. Like, my goal in teaching isn't to make a space that's so comfortable that we can just sit in our chairs and go forth unchanged. It's that we're actually meant to be commissioned by God to be a changed people out taking ground for the kingdom. And if that's what we are about, then we need to get aligned together and get on mission together. So my challenge isn't like, hey, get out the doors if you're not doing it. My challenge is like, hey, I want you to wrestle with like what is driving you to come to this place, because there's probably something. And something hopefully that leads you to be changed, and something that leads you to be on mission. And maybe the point isn't that you go out and disciple somebody else, but maybe you get discipled by somebody. That you can grow and you can mature and you can be prepared and equipped for every good work, that you can be sent out as a people to take ground for his kingdom. See, the challenge is that when we ignore God's call, it doesn't just affect out here. It affects something in here. There are implications, there are consequences as we ignore the call that Jesus placed on our lives. Here's what we see for Jonah. It says he went down into Joppa. And so when we saw on the map, it's south. He went down into Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. Again, it reiterates, it's not just that he's going to Tarshish, but he's fleeing from who God is. Like he's saying, I'm going to get out of his presence. I'm going to go so far away that he can't catch me. And it says here that he paid the fare. And that's important because if you look at some children's books, they got him like hiding in a barrel. Didn't happen. Right? He paid the fare. And that's significant because it was not a small amount of money that he had to pay. It's estimated that it took 12 to 18 months to get from Joppa to Tarshish. That was a commitment. This dude had to go. And he paid the fare so he could escape the presence of the Lord. And there's some language in here. When I talked about there's some strategic language, we're going to see it right here because God, he's just unbelievably creative. I love how he did this. He's really kind of set himself apart from everything else. When we see in verse 2, he says, arise. And then he also says, the wickedness of Nineveh has risen up to himself. And so what he's doing right there is he's setting himself apart from everybody else, that he is above all, but he's also calling everything up to himself. And we're going to see that throughout this entire story. And then we see here what happens with Jonah. See, Jonah's first response was he arose, and it's really he got up to get down, because we see here that he went down into Joppa, and then he goes eventually down into a ship, and eventually he goes down into a deep sleep. And so we've got, in this moment, we've got God being set apart. He is above everything else. He's calling everything up to himself, and we see Jonah's response, where it's not just a horizontal plane where he's fleeing to Tarshish, but there's a spiritual implication here, where he goes down into Joppa, and then he goes down into the ship, and he goes down into a deep sleep. So he's being pulled away. His fellowship, his vertical fellowship with the Lord is being stretched and pulled and separated from who he was created and called to be. And the same thing happens to us. Y'all, when we get the call from the Lord and he says, hey, I want you to go this way. And this call can be over big things like finances, because I know that that's hard. Or it could be other things like getting baptized and being like, God, like in an arm wrestling match with God. I don't know if you've ever done it, but it's really hard to do. And you're like, God, I don't want to do it. And then he's still calling you to it. Like there are steps that every single one of us gets to take in our faith journey. And so often we want to put up a fight when God's like, no. This faith thing's more about surrender. This faith thing's more about trust. This faith thing's more about turning over what you thought you knew and understanding that I know better. It's saying, hey, I'm in on you, Lord. That God knows what he is talking about. There's a fellowship break that happens as we go our own way. And the tension is that God is still calling us up to himself. He's still dialing the phone number as we hit the voicemail button. He's still reaching out to us, doing what we cannot do for ourselves. In James chapter 1, it speaks to this a little bit. Verse 23, it says, anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in a mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they have heard, but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. It's saying, man, like too often we look in the mirror and just forget what we look like. Too often, God says, hey, I've got Jonah as a mirror for you, and I want you to look into it so that you can see the spinach that's stuck in your teeth right now, that you can grow and mature and be stretched and then lead others to do the same. He's saying, I've got something better and bigger for you if you would only stop forgetting what you look like. Look in the mirror and remember who you are. I was doing my quiet time this morning, and it was in Luke 23, and it's over Jesus on trial. And it's this kangaroo court where they're just mocking him and making fun of him the whole time. And Jesus operates as the world's worst defense attorney. He gives himself no defense. They say, are you the Messiah? Do you say that you are? And he goes, you say that I am. Pilate finds out that there's nothing really wrong with Jesus, that he hadn't committed any crime. And so he goes to the people 3 different times. He says, hey, I haven't found a reason to hold anything against this man. And over again, the people shout, kill him. Pilate goes back again, a second time, a third time, and their shouts only get louder. And there's this verse that comes in. It says, and their shouts prevailed. And I was wrestling through that this morning because when I ignore God's call, it's because I allow another shout to prevail. You know what I mean? The shout of my own glory, or the shout of like doing things my way, or my desires, or my passions, or whatever it is, and saying, I know better, Lord. But there's another passage in Luke. It's Luke 19. Pharisees go to Jesus and they say, hey, your disciples, they're worshiping you. Are you going to stop them? And Jesus said, if they don't, the stones will cry out because their shouts will prevail. I added the last part. See, we're caught up between 2 different shouts in our lives. The shouts of our flesh, the shouts of our own desires, and the shouts that God has for us, where he is constantly calling us up back to himself. And I think too often we just get so caught up in saying, but I don't want spinach and I want to do my own thing, that we miss out on who he has called us to be. But I know for some of you, maybe you haven't made a decision yet. Maybe you've kind of come, you're like, hey, I want to figure out if this Jesus thing is real and what it looks like to turn my life over to him. Some of you might actually have received the call, and finally, for the first time, you're like, I'm going to answer the phone. So what I want you to do is, if you could just close your eyes and bow your heads with me. If you have a relationship with Jesus, I would just ask that you are just praying right now. Because I know that there are people in this room that God is calling to over and over again. He's been doing it your whole life. He's been saying, hey, I'm here. I'm calling you. Rise up. And I know it's been hard. I know you've got reasons that you've pushed back. I know that you've got situations that you've been in. I know that you've got desires and sin that you've been caught up in. I know that you have been lost and wayward. And I know that sometimes it can feel really good. But I also know the call is worth the answer. I also know that a cross led to a tomb that was empty. I also know that there was a king who says, hey, I've adopted you into sonship. I'm ready for you to be a part of my family if only you would sign the paperwork. And so if that's you, where you're like, hey, I want to give my life to Jesus. I'm done ignoring the call. I'm done going my own way. If that's you, I just want you to raise your hand right now with everybody's eyes closed. I want you to say, God, I am in on who you are. I see you. I am ready to do what you have called me to. I'm ready to be changed. You put your hands down. If that was a decision you made, here's my ask. We're going to have a song, and this song of response is going to be awesome because it's just really opening yourself up to who Jesus is and saying, hey, I'm available. I'm ready to be changed, transformed. If you've been a disciple of Jesus for a long time, you guys can open your eyes. If you've been a disciple of Jesus for a long time, the same thing is true. That he's calling you, and he's shaping you, and he's molding you. Jonah knew who God was, and he still went his own way. So here's my ask. During the song of response, I want you to raise that up to him. And if you gave your life to Jesus for the first time, at the end of that song, we're going to have prayer partners, and we would love for you to pray with them as they walk through the gospel with you and they share in the celebration that is about to take part. Would you pray with me? Jesus, we love you. And forgive us. Forgive us for the hidden sin, for the unreconciled relationships. Forgive us for the coarse joking. Forgive us for the wayward lives that we sometimes lean into. Lord, we're done with Tarshish. Thank you for the way that you pursue us, Lord, that you always call us back to yourself, that you're always willing to change your people into something new. God, I just ask that you continue your work in me and us as we go forward as a people on mission, that we can bring your kingdom here. That it's not just that we're changed, but our families are changed, that our community is changed, that we become a glory center for you, that we are constantly pointing back up to you, God. God, you are so good, and we love you, and we praise your name.